JLF's Brave New World welcomes you back to our second session of the day. Those of you who missed our earlier session, The Ocean of Geopolitics, Sanjeev Sanyal in conversation with Vikram Chandra, and all our other sessions featuring Oran Palmer, Devdas Patnaik, Jairam Ramesh, Margaret Atwood, Marcus Mann, Chandushin Greer, and Chandy, Shelja Sen, Vikram Chandra, John Ralston Saul, and so many others. You can catch these on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, or on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM, Bajate Raho. Our next session today is If All the World and Love Were Young, Stephen Sexton in conversation with Elaine Canning. A session that uncovers the core of poetic inspiration, exploring Stephen's acclaimed debut poetry collection involving love, loss, memory, childhood, imagination, and grief. Sexton's verses convey the anguish of a mother's death through the levels of the classic video game Super Mario World. Stephen Sexton was the winner of the 2016 UK National Poetry Competition and the recipient of an ACES award from the Arts Council of Northern Ireland. He received an Eric Gregory Award in 2018. If All the World and Love Were Young was the winner of the Forward Prize for Best First Collection. Elaine Canning is a writer and the executive officer of the Swansea University's Dylan Thomas Prize, author of a book and several papers in Spanish Golden Age drama. Canning is currently working on her first short story collection and a novel. Elaine Canning and the Dylan Thomas Prize are also partners and collaborators with the Jaipur Literature Festival. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section below. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And in case we drop off, you know what to do, just hang in there and we'll be right back on Facebook. Ladies and gentlemen, If All the World and Love Were Young, Stephen Sexton in conversation with Elaine Canning.
Hello everyone, welcome to this session of the Jaipur Literature Festival's Brave New World series. Hello Stephen, it's so lovely to see you. We were just saying, weren't we, that the last time we saw each other in person was actually in Jaipur at this wonderful festival.
Which I can hardly believe was this year, the year 2020, the year of many things, the year that we assume will end at some point.
It feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it?
It does.
It's a delight to talk to you today about your award-winning debut collection, If All the World and Love Were Young. This is a gorgeous collection which addresses the themes of grief and loss, of the death of your mother, and childhood and memory. And it's a collection which crosses two worlds. And given this strange world that we find ourselves in, I wonder if that's as good a place to start today with our conversation. It's a collection that moves between the real world and an unreal world, a special, dare I say, super world, the world of Super Mario. So, Stephen, I wondered, how did the world of Super Mario come to inhabit your collection?
Thanks, Elaine, and just as always, to thank you so much for reading and thinking about this book. It really matters a lot to me, and I'm delighted to talk to you about it. It starts in a kind of silly way, if I may say so. I mean, a long time ago, let's say about 5 or so years ago, I was writing a lot of poems that were typically about paintings, let's say, or photographs or objects of visual art anyway. I'm really interested in I suppose what we call ekphrasis, this term originating from ancient Greek rhetoric, where you would describe in often very intense detail an object of visual art, so intensely as though you could make this missing object appear in front of an audience. That's how great your description might be. So I suppose it was originally used as rhetoric, that somebody would, almost like a magician might produce this object in front of an audience as though it were really there. So I became really, really interested in this because, as we live our lives, as we do now, so much of our lives seems to be involved in images, often not really the things themselves, but representations of them. So I was writing all these kinds of poems, about paintings, about photographs. And to be honest, I grew so tremendously bored of what I was doing that I couldn't keep doing it. There was this sense where each image, each figure, it demands its own special attention. So to make a coherent book, let's say, with all these curious objects sitting next to each other, it didn't seem like I could make it work. So when I found myself a little bored, I thought, well, what other visual objects matter to me? What else can I think of in the same kind of detail? And as I don't know about you, but I often work the most intensely on something when I'm not supposed to be doing it. So taking a break from what I was supposed to be doing, I thought, why not look at Super Mario? I mean, I'd spent so much of my childhood in these odd little worlds that Mario lives in. Why not treat that as a similar object of visual art? Why not describe in the most intense detail, the most imaginative kind of detail? Why not describe that and see what happens? So I admit I was doing it mischievously to start with. I was doing it as a kind of joke, to bring the language of a poem, let's say, or a poetics to something that many people might consider to be not an appropriate pair for the poem. So I thought, why not try to describe this? Let's see what happens by doing it. So that's where I started with Mischief.
With Mischief, what a great place to start.
Sure.
And so what you've created is a collection of two worlds. I would say two people, two parts, but it's also a very rich, multi-layered collection. And I wondered how these worlds and layers intersect and fuse, and what happens in the transition from part one to part two of the collection.
Absolutely, there's a lot of layering, and maybe in a moment this might be a good example. I might be able to read an example, a short example that might highlight this in some way. So really, what I will have to address, of course, is that this isn't really a book about Super Mario. This is a book that's pretending to be about Super Mario. So in this process where I was writing a little poem for every level of Super Mario World, and many of us, I'm sure, know Mario's condition, but for those of us who don't, may I just say Mario is a video game character. He's a small Italian plumber. His condition in life is that he must move left to right across the screen through all kinds of fantastic landscapes and that sort of thing. So I started writing about these and imagining what these landscapes would be as real ones, and imagining, if there's a tree on the screen, well, how can I describe that? Is tree enough? Should it be a specific kind of tree? So I end up in all this, this kind of a translation moment, really. But thinking about that world, that digital world, I had to find a way to talk about it, and to talk about it is to use language, but to use the language of our world. So immediately there's this establishment of these two worlds together. But when I was doing this, when I was thinking about Mario, I couldn't not think about my childhood. And by thinking about my childhood, I thought of the place I grew up in, the house I grew up in. And thinking about this, found myself thinking about my mother, who died in 2012. So I was starting to work on this around 2015. I believe. And, I hadn't really found a way, I wasn't looking for a way, I think, to write about grief. But nevertheless, I was surprised to find that I was doing that part of the way through all this thinking myself back into a kind of childhood place, this started to creep in, this elegiac element, this grief started to, I guess, insist to be talked about. And I made a conscious choice to let that. And in a broad sense, the idea of there being one world and another world. I mean, I suppose death is the really big thing. It's the thing that causes a two-worldedness. But for me, my two worlds were the blending of the real world and the blending of Mario's world, and trying to set these two narratives beside each other. One of a child adventuring in a video game, and one of an adult trying to understand what the world is like by talking about a digital world. Would it be helpful, do you think, maybe to read a little short example of that, or shall I hold on for a moment?
I think it would be lovely for you to read. Yeah.
Okay, I'll read something from towards the start here that I think kind of sets this sense out. And just to set the scene for you, when I was spending all my time playing Mario as a young person, sitting in a little room with a big patio window door to my left, and looking out at the garden, and looking to the right at my screen. So there's very much this sense of looking left and right and seeing, the real world, whatever that is, as we're learning these days, and the digital world, and really looking between them and thinking, well, how are these different? How are these the same? So those are the circumstances of this little extract. The title is Yoshi's Island 2. Pixels and bits, their perpendicularity. One of the worlds I live in is as shallow as a pane of glass. The threshold of the window sets a frame around the holly tree, wild funguses slimy with dew and toxicity. The rubies of holly berries sing on the branches the robins hide among, and the veins of ivy vines wind around the slumping trunk and boughs, slowberries in the blackthorn and the carcinogenic bracken. Groundsels loiter along the low-dashed wall the daisies loll about. One summer's day, I'm summoned home to hear of cells which split and glitch so haphazardly. Someone is called to intervene with poisons drawn from strange and peregrine trees flourishing in distant kingdoms. We take the air in the garden, bitter with berries and mushrooms too toxic to eat, where the grass bows in an unexpected breeze. So there's very much this sense of looking out and looking over here and trying to make these two worlds exist, as one. I think was an ambition I started out with, to think, how are these things the same? How are they different?
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful poem. I think one of the other poems in there that really struck me in terms of that fusion of bringing those worlds together, it comes a little bit later on, Butterbridge 2, and it's where you're in traffic on the Albert Bridge, and there is this gorgeous image that continues to stay with me, which is when you talk about the murmuration of starlings being like a smudge on the setting sun, or is it the happy thumbprint of Miyamoto, who of course is the creator of Mario? It's such a beautiful image. I wanted to pick up on Yoshi's Island 2 actually, and what you were just saying about these two worlds and how they fuse. I think there's so much also, there's a richness in there of language, which would be lovely to talk about, because I really feel that the feel of the video game penetrates right into the language. So when you talk about pixels and bits and the cells that split and glitch, I get this sense of the video game coming alive in the language itself. And I wondered whether that was something you set out to do from the beginning, or whether it's something that evolved through the writing process. I think, Stephen, our volume is a little bit low, so if we can speak up a little bit, that would be great.
Can I do that? I'll speak up a little. Absolutely, and I mean, to talk, I suppose, briefly about the whole talking about images thing again. I mean, I guess it's perfectly interesting to do that, but you end up with a collection of images that no one may necessarily care about. So it became really important to me, and it is important, I think, in every way that the kind of writing I'm interested in is an event in language. It's not necessarily just talking about something. I feel that the language should be affected in some way, that the language should show something of what's being talked about. So for me, it was really important that I try to make the language feel like it is coming from somewhere else. I mean, I came to think of it as an act of translation, that I was trying to find in English, in the English language, in poems. I was trying to find an equivalent, or to make it feel like I had translated the video game, that this was the best I could do. I was, I suppose this is why I describe it as a joke, because that's kind of an absurd thing to do, is to try to find in English, in poems, some way of rendering this game. So I did a couple of things to try to help me do that. One is on the level of the syllable. All the lines in this book, they're all 16 syllables long. The Super Nintendo, as we all know, but I'll say it anyway, is a 16-bit console. It's which I understand, I believe. I'll be happily wrong. So if anyone who's watching knows more than I do, please correct me. But I believe that refers to the amount of information that its processor can cycle, can move through in one sweep of its processor. So this seemed, it's a different kind of memory, right? There's a digital memory being sorted by this processor. My own memory is being sorted by, myself, by the processor. I guess what the result of that is it feels like these long sweeps. The lines are quite long. All at 16 syllables. There are also no commas in the book, which I feel might be a frustrating aspect, because it leads to odd syntax. It leads to phrases that appear like they don't quite make sense, but they do grammatically. But I understand the comma might help. But I was trying to get this texture, this feeling of movement, of a little video game character moving forward or moving back a few steps. Trying to create a texture in the language that felt like a game, which I think is it's a difficult thing to do. I think, but I wanted something to happen in the language. For me, it wasn't merely enough to describe things. I think the language has to carry some trace of its origin.
Sure, and I think also what you then do is you take that texture that you've just described, and that texture then is also applied to the title of the collection, because the title comes from the first line of Walter Raleigh. Isn't that right? The nymphs reply to the shepherd, which of course is a response to Marlowe's The Passionate Shepherd, to his love. Why did you decide to choose that first line for the title of the collection?
Surely Walter Raleigh must be somebody's favorite poet. I mean, I've never heard anybody say it. Have you ever heard anybody say that?
No. Must be.
But somebody loves Sir Walter Raleigh. I guess a couple of reasons. I mean, for instance, one thing that amused me is that it's exactly half of my line, so it's an 8-syllable phrase. My line is 16 syllables. But more importantly, what I've done with Mario is create this, or tried to understand Mario as a pastoral, as a kind of pastoral landscape. And these two poems, I suppose, are in English anyway, some of the very earliest examples of what we would call pastoral poetry. Well, I say the very earliest, but early enough anyway. And just to say briefly that this argument, there's Christopher Marlowe, as you say, then there's Walter Raleigh. They have this sort of argument where Marlowe writes his sort of lovely pastoral poem that we know, "Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove." And it's this poem of kind of, a lack of complication. He is trying to woo someone to come and live the life of a shepherd in a kind of eternal paradise where, nothing will ever go wrong. Things will be perfect forever. And I guess a year later, I believe, Raleigh writes a response that offers a kind of correction, and says, this isn't true. This isn't right. There isn't an ideal world. There isn't happiness forever. There is not, a lack of complication forever. Things change, people die. So I feel as though this argument, in many ways, was the same one I was making, in the sense that Mario constitutes a kind of ideal world for me. That it is uncomplicated. I can be there. I can move through its worlds, like many people do, and are often told off for. This idea that you're wasting your time, or your imagination in that is not of the same kind of value. that there is no consequence. And I suppose I'm putting that against that ideal world, against really trying to understand what grief is, which seems to me to represent more this response to this argument. Things aren't perfect forever. Things aren't lovely. So Raleigh's first line, if all the world and love were young, just really stood out to me. I love the if in it. I love the idea that it's so conditional. I suppose it's kind of polite in the poem, the original poem, but I really like the idea that I suppose that firstly that my book was, I think, declaring itself as siding with that part of the argument. To say that's where I find myself, despite everything that's happening in this book, about trying to understand, how comforting it might be to deny what's really happening. That realistically, I must say this has happened. I must try to acknowledge that. But as I say, that it starts on if, as if the whole book was conditional. I love the idea that if this was so, then everything else. That it starts with a premise.
So can I ask you then, moving on to your readers, if your reader doesn't know anything about Mario, if your reader is more or less familiar with Mario, does it really matter? Does it really matter?
I think it really does matter in some ways. Yeah, I mean, it was one of my biggest concerns, Elaine. That I know that this might be slightly exclusive. It was a big worry that I had, or that it might appear, I don't know, not serious. Maybe that this isn't an appropriate kind of subject for poems. I thought about that a little bit. It didn't keep me up at night. I think I slept okay, but I was aware of it. I was thinking, what does this say about me, or what does this say about the book? But I suppose what my thinking is, I suppose, first of all, it's not really about Mario. It's about it's about trying to understand loss. It just so happens that this is the way that I was going about it. But more than that, I find myself thinking about other kinds of nature poems. I mean, one thing that this is a book of nature poems, really. It's talking about landscapes, it's talking about trees and flowers and moving through them and being in them. It's really like that. And when I thought of how other nature poems work, I don't feel as though any of us would ever say, oh, well, I've never been there, so I don't believe it, or I've never been there, so I can't get it. I don't think we would ever do that. And I do understand, of course, that it's different, that landscapes and real places do exist. But for the reader, I haven't been there, but I believe you. And if anything, this video game is right there. It's on YouTube. You could go and you could see it for yourself. You could see exactly how I have described and what I've described. So I do understand that there is a certain kind of difficulty, perhaps, or an obstacle that one starts out with. But it's not really about that. And I am interested in how we talk about images of things, how we talk about, that's what a nature poem does. It makes an image of nature. It's not really different than, in some ways, it's not really different from a photograph. And in other ways, of course, it is. But images, I suppose, is how I diffuse this in my own imagination. A nature poem is an image. This is a set of images too.
Absolutely. And what you also do is you acknowledge your reader here. So you refer to your reader as a super reader in the poem Funky towards the end. And when we get to the credits, which I'll talk about in a moment, you actually describe your readers as most excellent and generous. And I love that. And I wondered why you decided, why you opted for this direct address, and whose voice is it? Whose voice is this?
Yeah, thank you so much for thinking about those, Elaine. I think that there are some things that are complicated there. I mean, in terms of voice, I am the author, of course, but there are different voices in it, and sometimes it's my voice, sometimes it's Mario's voice. If I may give him a voice. One thing that Mario is known for saying more than other things is "It's a me, Mario." And I really love the fact that reading that literally, it's a me, it's a variety of me, it's one me, it's a sort of me, seemed like a nice thing to to quote at the start of the book. So there are a couple of voices in it. The voices are also, a fairly common aspect of elegies, of poems of grief, and often elegies will use a lot of other voices. They will quote, they will reference other poems that have gone before them. And part of that is grief, that it is so hard to say something that the elegist relies on someone who said it before, in order to lean on it, to try to find a way of talking about it. So it is a common element of elegies, that they will contain lots of other voices. In terms of addressing the reader, I think it's it's a big moment. I think it's really a kind of turn to camera, I suppose, in some ways. I wanted to do it because, kind of a silly reason, in the video game itself, there's a really lovely moment. Some of you will know that Mario collects coins, little coins, all the way through his games. In the video game, at a certain point, a particular point, it's spelled out in coins. You are a super player. Thank you. You are a super player. And as a young person doing that, this relatively mild moment of fourth wall breaking was kind of revolutionary to me. I was stunned. I felt naively that the game knew I was there, or something really strange like that. So when it came to that moment in my book, I thought I wanted to reflect how moving that was to me. And I suppose I wanted to acknowledge the fact that I hoped someone was there, someone was reading this, and to say, thank you, that this is hard. This is really hard for me to say, and also to say, sometimes this is kind of hard reading. This is difficult in places. I just thought I wanted to, say I've enjoyed talking to you. I'm grateful you were there. It just seemed like a nice moment.
It's a lovely moment for the reader. And then, of course, you give us the credits. You give us the credits presented in order of appearance.
Yes.
And we get this sense of the rush of credits at the end of a game. What really struck me about that was, you talked about, no punctuation, no commas in the rest of the collection. But when we get to the credits, we've got 4 pages of continuous names, places, imaginary and real. And the only thing we have separating those is a comma. So it's 4 continuous pages with nothing separating these things but a comma. So you get this real rush of credits at the end. Why do you give the reader the credit run? Why was it important to you to do that?
I think there's a couple of reasons, and what, Elaine, thank you again so much. I hadn't really thought about the commas. I don't mind telling you, I wish I'd planned this, because it looks like that's where all the missing commas went. That made everything else so tricky. Thank you so much for mentioning that. In the future, I might claim to have done that on purpose. It's really interesting. I included these credits partly, but related to that point about voices. I suppose there are a lot of voices in this, and part of it was to act as a kind of bibliography, a kind of way of referencing or acknowledging. So I quote from a lot of people. I quote from Shakespeare. I quote from Michael Donaghy, the poet. I quote from Johnny Cash at one point. So it's a way of acknowledging where that these phrases come from people. It's also a way, I think, of helping to orient the reader. I hope that some of these things will stand out, and you might be able to look back and think, oh, that's where I was. I was there. I can move around it. So there was that. There's also a really maybe playful, maybe irritating, I'm not sure, aspect of it. But I really love the idea that at the end of this book, I was asking a reader to read the book twice. So I have all the, I have basically nouns in this. There's nouns and commas, just all these things that occur throughout it, but just in isolation. So I really like the idea of having. You see why I have to thank the reader when I do things like this. The idea that I would ask them to read the book twice, but really quickly, this really compressed version, and that it would almost feel like. Like a sort of life passing before one's eyes kind of moment, that it would happen so quickly. You would feel this thing twice. I suppose the only other thing to say about that is, and to mention again what we were talking about at the very start, this idea of describing images, or describing paintings or photographs or visual, objects of visual art. I sort of like the idea of thanking things for their appearance, certainly like in order of appearance, but also to say, thank you for lending me your appearance for this book. Thank you, thank you moon, thank you sun, thank you trees, thank you for lending the appearance of you to my book. So there is that appearance in the sense of occurring throughout the book. But also, thank you for your appearance. Objects was something else I wanted to do. However silly that is, but since I'm very interested in that big gulf between a word and what it represents, it felt appropriate to thank things for their time, for being in my book.
Well, I have to say thank you for all of that, for engaging the reader and for the credits and for all of those aspects, really interesting aspects that you bring to the collection. I think we've got time. I think we've got time for a few more questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience questions, if that's okay.
That would be lovely.
There are a couple of things I really want to ask you. So here goes. Here's the first. When I first read the collection, without giving anything away, when I first read this collection, I came to a particular finishing point. This was several months ago when I read it for the first time. When I read the collection subsequently, and each time I've read it since that first time, I come to a different end point, for want of a better term. So I wondered whether, is it intended that there are two or maybe multiple endpoints to this collection?
Yes, and I sympathize. I find there are some books I've read where I find the end point very, very early. Sometimes it's as early as 20 pages in, where one stops reading it. But absolutely, there are. I think there are two endings in this book, and one of them I suppose is really concerned with the video game, and the other one is concerned with the other world, the real world to some extent. And I suppose because I follow this video game all the way through, it comes to a kind of narrative end where you defeat the antagonist, you rescue the princess, you're done. You've achieved the thing that you wanted to do, and that's where one of the endings I think in this book. But even in the video game, as with everything else, there can be another ending. One must complete. One must discover every level, do everything that one might do. So there are two endings, and my second ending is somewhat hidden towards the very end of the book, after the credits, after all of this, and it's partly to do, I suppose, with a kind of narrative drive where you must, to some extent, end where you started, and the book ends exactly where it started, which is part of the hero's journey. It's I guess one of those rules of narrative that I suppose, if it is a rule, that I suppose I'm following. So there is a kind of incompleteness, I hope, in that first ending, enough of an ending to be an ending, but I think there's hopefully a fuller kind of closure at the second ending.
Absolutely. So before we go to the audience questions then, and I'm sure there are several people who want to ask you various things, I think it's only fitting that we return to the poems themselves, and to one in particular which invites the reader into the world. I wondered if you wanted to finish off with that, Stephen.
Yeah, gladly, I would love to. And yeah, so this is the very last one that's kind of hidden after the credits, after the acknowledgements, after all of that. And yeah, so it's the end, I suppose. So we're back in Yoshi's house. May this unhaunted house be yours, and may it be happy and bright. May the creak in the rafters be a sparrow returning to nest after all these years, and before the many more I step aside. And if you find someday, dear friend, my sad head upon your shoulders, go out into the world. Say, world, it's been so long. Say, world, hello.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Stephen. Absolute joy talking to you.
It's lovely. Thank you.
We have a couple of questions coming in.
Oh, wonderful.
The first is from Namita Kokali, who asks, where and how do you see the fusion of poetry and virtual culture?
I think that's an interesting thing. I mean, I thank you very much for asking. I suppose I'm interested to the extent that poetry isn't already engaging with certain aspects of poetry, of digital culture, and I wonder if it has for some time. I suppose when I think of digital culture, I'm inclined to think of I think most of the internet, and I think of the internet. Of course, there are many other things, but for me, it seems to come down to a fundamental relationship between image and text. And I think of the internet as being full of images, most of them cats, but images and text next to each other. And it occurred to me that. I was saying to Elaine recently that I mentioned some paintings in this book as well as a way of thinking about how images work. But none of these paintings I mentioned have I seen. I've seen digital images of them. I've seen versions of them. I've never seen the things themselves. And it kind of occurs to me, like I was saying about the nature poem, say, it may as well contain a virtual image too. The images seem to operate in similar ways. Some iterations of them, such as digital prints that occur online, they are very, very, very good copies, but they're not the thing themselves. They're very, very good copies. The natural image, let's say, that's involved in a poem. Is arguably a much less good copy, but nevertheless, it has that relationship with what it refers to. So I suppose I'm really interested in how images exist in a poem and how they exist in a digital format, or even in a as a painting. I'm really interested in how they can both be images but function in such different ways. So I don't know when it comes to digital culture. I don't imagine. For me, anyway, I don't imagine sort of horrible blends, and in my imagination, they're also in horrible tones and colors. Like I see, when I think of poems and digital culture, I think of a terrible lime green or something like that over an image, maybe of a cat. But I think the exact integration of them, I'm not sure, but I am absolutely thrilled about how images and text interact, and that seems to be something that's a couple of thousand years old at this point, certainly, maybe older.
Absolutely. So we've got another question for you, Stephen. This is from Agastia, who asks, how important is the accessibility of meaning, and should one have to work hard to solve the poem, solve in inverted commas?
I'm so grateful for that question and for the solve in inverted commas, because it's a condition. I wish I could exclude myself completely, but I can't. Mostly of young men or teenage boys writing poems who don't write poems, they write riddles. And I've never wanted to be involved in that kind of riddling or the idea that something might be solved. I think it's difficult to say because I think we respond to a certain degree of difficulty in things. It's nice to have things fall into a certain kind of shape in a certain kind of place. But I suppose when I think of meaning, I can speak for myself, I suppose, in this case, which is it's a really simple narrative that that a fundamental loss is experienced. That is pretty straightforward. I suppose what I'm really interested in is how language is affected by something like this. If you can see see how language is changed. So I suppose in that regard, meaning is there, and it's evident in the language, and some of it is difficult, I think, which is okay. I think vagueness isn't usually, it's not particularly forgivable. I think ambiguity is forgivable, but vagueness is a really tough thing. So I suppose I hope that the idea of meaning can exist in the quality of the language or the textures of the language. But beyond that, I'm not too sure.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we'll take two questions, two related questions together, if we may. So the first is from Ria. Ria asks, does poetry help you in dealing with anxiety, especially during such tough times? And Sanya asks, grief looks different on everybody, but isn't it poetry that binds us all?
Thank you for those lovely questions. I might think about the second one first, if that's okay. I absolutely agree, and that's something that I hoped might. The thing about grief, I suppose, in text, in poems, the elegy in general, I suppose, is that anything can be. It seems like like an object with a particularly powerful gravitational pull. It just seems to drag everything into it. That it becomes such a devastating kind of context where if you're walking down the street, not grieved, you're merely walking down the street. But if you're walking down the street and you're grieved, you're walking down the street as a grieving person. It seems like this context that is so devastating that it draws so much into it. And one of the things that means, I suppose, is that as we know, that there's no wrong way to do grief. It doesn't seem like there is. And I sort of hope that if there's no wrong way to do it, why not do it in a kind of silly way? Why not see how Mario, for instance, this object of pure, colourful, delightful joy, can it also be used to talk about grief? And for me, I think it can. That was, I suppose, part of a challenge to see if that could happen. But I do think that, as you say, there's no wrong way. That's not what you said, of course. But I think there's no wrong way to go about grieving, and therefore, let's see how we can extend it. Let's see how we can bring other people into it in some way, which I'm conscious about because Mario is pretty popular. I don't know how many hundreds of millions of video games have been sold. So there are many people out there who know this somewhat intimately. And although they know grief privately and often individually, this is another thing that they may know in a different way. So I thought that was interesting to try that. When I think of anxiety and poems, these are certainly anxious times, and it's made, for me, it has made the world kind of unusual and kind of unreal looking. I mean, so much of it is looking out through a window, which is to say, looking at a framing of the natural world and the real world, not being in it itself, which is a really curious thing. When I think of whether or not it helps me with a certain kind of anxiety, I can't say with certainty. It does help, but I suppose I think of I think of poems as made things, of moments, or objects made of language, and I suppose would I think of a painting helping me in the same way? I might. I suppose for me, I can't say with certainty that it does, but I certainly believe that it can. I think that if it is useful, then let it be.
Absolutely, thank you. I think we've got about a minute or so left, Stephen, and we've got so many lovely questions coming in. So I'll give you two more. I'm sorry that we won't be able to get through all of them. But just to wrap up, we've got one from Rowan who asks, what kind of poetry do you think may emerge from this pandemic? And do you believe we will see a new genre of pandemic poetry? And another lovely one from Anita Sonny is, did your mother read a lot of poetry to you as a child?
Thank you very much for those questions. Rowan, just to say, I think with pandemic poetry, I wonder if we might, but as I was saying, I mean, it doesn't feel enough for me simply to report or to record what's happening, because I mean, all of us are experiencing this, and while the exact measures of our experiences will be different, it's broadly the same. So for me, I would welcome it, but for me, it would have to do something with language. It would have to show how this has changed language. or caused an event or something in language, that would thrill me. So I hope that could happen. And oddly, in response to the second question, no, my mother didn't really read poems to me, or we didn't really have a lot of books in our house. Now that I think about it, I mean, they read a lot. My parents, they read newspapers. There was a copy of The Silence of the Lambs that had been read a couple of times, but not a lot of books. Which is odd. I mean, on one hand, I think about this often. Occasionally when the book came out, I found myself thinking, what am I going to say to her when she reads this? And then this terrible, terrible thought comes immediately after, which is, that's not possible. And the book wouldn't exist were that possible. So there's always this sort of terrifying exchange that an elegy is involved in, or that I'm involved in, where you can never have both. You can't have both of those circumstances. You can't have both worlds. You get one.
What a way to end, Stephen. We get one world. Thank you so much for such a lovely, honest conversation. And thank you, everybody, for the questions. I'd like to invite Sanjoy to join us again at this point.
Thank you so much, Elaine, and thank you so much, Stephen Sexton. That was just beautiful. And thank you to the trees, and thank you to day, and thank you to night. And that closing poetry was just wonderful, as was your comment about grief, that it just drags everything in, the gravitational pull. That's really certainly got me thinking. I'm sorry that we couldn't put all the questions out there to Stephen, and those of you, perhaps what we'll do, Elaine, Stephen, we will send the questions out to you, and perhaps if you could agree to answer them, and then we will post them back on YouTube and Facebook. But thank you all for watching, and once again, Elaine and Stephen, thank you so much for being with us and sharing such a beautiful piece of literature and poetry. I certainly don't know anything about Mario. I was told today by my colleagues who sort of sniffed at me when I didn't get the pronunciation right. Don't know about Mario, and I'm like, no. But it didn't matter, because your poetry is just still so incredible. So thank you for that. And for those of you who remember, you must log in for our next session on Wednesday, the 15th of July, for another set of great sessions, The Dancer and the Dance, Sonal Mansingh in conversation with Suneet Tandon, scholar, artist, dancer, and choreographer Sonal Mansingh's passion for her art is matched by her passion for life. In conversation with Suneet Tandon, the cultural icon and Rajya Sabha MP speaks out of the theory and practice of classical dance and its place in the collective consciousness of India. She takes the legacy of three dance forms, Bharatnatyam, Odissi, and Chau, and interprets them for JLF's Brave New World. And this is at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 2:30 p.m. British Summer Time, and 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The second session on Saturday, the 11th of July will be, it should be Saturday, the 15th of July, should be Every Creature Has a Story, Janaki Lennon and Rom Whitaker in conversation. The wildlife conversationist couple, Rom Whitaker and Janaki Lennon, invites us to explore the hidden wonders of the natural kingdom, discover the secrets of the giraffe's astonishing neck, the song of the female nightingale, the eggs of timid glass frogs, and the evolution of bearded dragons through Every Creature Has a Story by Janaki Lennon in this enchanting session. This will be at 8:30 p.m. IST, 4 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. What better way to follow what we've just heard from Stephen? So from all of us at JLF's Brave New World, thank you. Thank you for being around. Thank you for listening. Thank you for adding to our wonderful viewership. We've crossed 1.5 million viewers on JLF's Brave New World. So thank you once again. Have a great week.